It's wonderful having a son on the homestead to help out. That's the biggest deal of all when you have your family.
Nobody warns you about the moment a legend becomes a man. One frame, he's the guy who can resurrect a dead engine with nothing but wire and willpower. And then between one heartbeat and the next, you see his hands shake. You see his jaw tighten the way it does when he's trying to swallow something that won't go down easy. And suddenly every story you ever told yourself about Otto Kilcher starts cracking right down the middle. This isn't about the accident or the cameras or the ratings. What this is about is what happens when someone who built his entire identity around being unbreakable finally meets the one thing that doesn't care how many Alaskan winters he survived, and it's about what we all chose to do when we had front row seats to his breaking point. Because we watched. Every single one of us watched. And most of us never once asked whether we should have. Otto Kilcher was never supposed to be a television character. And that's the part that gets buried under 12 seasons of dramatic scoring and drone footage. The sixth child of Swiss immigrants Yule and Ruth Kilcher, he grew up on a homestead 11 miles outside Homer, Alaska, on land his father claimed under the Homestead Act in 1941 with an axe and a rifle and the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from leaving everything you've known behind. Survival made itself physical out there. A daily negotiation between a human body and a landscape that has never once cared whether you lived or died. Otto absorbed that negotiation from childhood, learning to read weather before he could read books, learning to fix machinery before he was old enough to drive it, building up knowledge that doesn't come from manuals, but from decades of actual necessity pressing itself into your hands. By the time Discovery Channel arrived with a camera crew, Otto had already lived 70 years of a life that needed no narration, and he reportedly laughed when they explained the premise. 70 years of living quietly, and now you want to put it on television? The brutal irony is that Alaska, The Last Frontier, the show that was supposed to celebrate his self-reliance, would eventually make him dependent on its spotlight in ways nobody, least of all Otto, ever anticipated. Before the cameras, before the ratings, there was just the land. And the land doesn't negotiate with your resume. It doesn't care about your legend or the fact that you once fixed a bulldozer with dental floss and pure spite. It waits. Otto's first visible brush with physical limitation came through a hernia surgery in 2016, and he admitted with that characteristic half grimace that he could actually feel the tugging while the doctor worked. For a man who had spent decades forcing his body through things it had no business doing, the indignity of lying still on an operating table while someone else fixed what was broken cut deeper than the incision itself. Viewers noticed the way you notice a hairline fracture in a bridge you cross every single day, not alarming enough to stop you, but there in the back of your mind. What came next didn't announce itself with sirens, because real catastrophe rarely does. It crept in at the edges, disguised as something manageable. Otto's breathing changed, not dramatically, not in a way that makes good television, just a hitch, a hesitation, a sound he produced when he thought nobody was paying attention. By the time anyone looked closely enough to understand what that sound meant, a failing artery had been ticking inside the chest of a man who had built his entire identity around being the one who never stops. What Discovery's cameras never captured were the pain medications tucked into his coat pocket between takes, the nights Charlotte watched him breathe and counted the seconds between each exhale, the quiet, terrible communication that passes between two people who know when something is seriously wrong. Only Otto Kilcher would try to fix a failing artery the same way he fixed a busted tractor, by ignoring it until it absolutely couldn't be ignored anymore. The ox attack arrived with the blunt, accidental violence that the frontier specializes in. Out in the middle of a whiteout, an animal blinded by the storm, charged with the force of something that doesn't understand consequences. His heavy coat, his thick gloves, the layers of instinct and experience he'd wrapped around himself over 7 decades. None of it absorbed what came next. The hoof connected with his ribs and sent him down into the snow in a way his body recognized immediately as different from everything else he'd survived. The homestead's wireless radio had gone out just minutes before, which meant there was no SOS, no backup plan. A neighbor spotted blood in the drifts and radioed the crew camp, and what followed was the kind of rescue that happens in the gap between disaster and survival, where everything depends on timing and luck and the particular quality of someone's attention on a day they might otherwise have stayed inside. EMTs moved through waist-deep snow with frozen gloves and gauze and whatever the situation offered. The helicopter rotors cut through the storm like a question nobody wanted answered. Charlotte learned what had happened the way you learn terrible things in a crisis, all at once, with nowhere to put the information. Ivan Kilcher and August Kilcher did what their generation does with the unbearable. They typed it into phones and sent it into the world. "Dad's hanging on," Ivan wrote, "but it's touch and go." Otto spent 5 hours on an operating table while the world he'd built held its breath. When the episode finally aired, the one the promos had been labeling "He Might Die," viewers received a title card. Otto is receiving medical attention. No hospital footage, no ICU, no mention of 5 hours of surgery or the morphine recovery. The man who survived the snow and the beast and the helicopter ride got reduced to 11 words on a black screen. The homestead told the truth that the show wouldn't. Trucks sat idling where his toolbox had always rested, and the sound of his hammer on metal disappeared into a silence that pressed against everyone left in it. Avon moved more carefully through the work, doing what needed doing, but feeling the weight of doing it without the man who had always made it look like second nature. August paced the herd and called the cows by name, and in his voice you could hear the question nobody wanted to ask. What holds this place together when Otto isn't the one holding it? Charlotte typed out a statement more honest than anything the show had broadcast in 12 seasons. She wrote that there had been real blood and real tears, that it had been a devastating time for the Kilcher family. Producers scrambled to balance her honesty against the show's polished surface, pulling cameras back just as she broke, swinging them toward August, making a joke about a busted milking machine. Reality TV doesn't wait for consent, it waits for the cut. When Otto eventually came home, leaning on a cane and wearing a face rearranged by everything it had seen and survived, the homestead was technically the same place. Same tools, same land, same animals, same cold. But the people inside it had been changed in ways that couldn't be walked back. Avon's shoulders carried something new. August's eyes held a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Charlotte received her husband back with relief that contains grief inside it, because once you've imagined the world without someone, the world with them in it is never quite uncomplicated again. They had filled his boots, and in doing so, discovered the actual dimensions of what he had quietly carried for years. And the loneliness at the center of the Otto Kilcher legend came into focus for all of them at once. Discovery Channel's response to his diminishing capacity revealed everything about what the show had always valued. Screen time that had given Otto 22 minutes per episode dropped below 5 by mid-season 12, and producers began splicing archived footage into new episodes, reusing a shot of him chopping wood from season 8, layering old voiceovers into scenes where he wasn't physically present. Fans tracking the show on Reddit and IMDb noticed the continuity errors, including a truck model in a window reflection that hadn't been sold in Alaska since 2015. The network had found a way to keep Otto in the show without actually including him, and that was somehow more unsettling than simply acknowledging his absence honestly. Season 11's premiere pulled 2.1 million viewers, but by mid-season, as his screen time evaporated into recycled cameos totaling around 7 minutes in episode 6, ratings dropped 23.8% to 1.6 million, steeper than the decline Deadliest Catch experienced after Captain Phil Harris died. Change.org petitions demanding Otto's return gathered over 15,000 signatures within weeks. The numbers around Ivan and August's increased presence told a story the network hadn't intended. Solo segments featuring the younger Kilchers saw social media engagement drop 19% compared to Otto's gruffest moments, and viewers between 18 and 35 tuned out fastest, directly contradicting Discovery's assumption that fresh faces would attract new audiences. Leaked 2021 production notes revealed producers had been planning a generational transition since season 9, tracking Ivan's social media engagement at 3 times Otto's rate among younger viewers. None of that mattered when it landed, because you can't replace a specific kind of knowledge with algorithm-friendly content. One YouTube comment captured it better than any ratings report. Viewers didn't tune in for perfection or polished technique. They tuned in to watch a man argue with a frozen engine for 20 minutes and eventually win. The deeper loss was happening entirely off camera. Otto had spent years training more than 20 Homer teenagers annually in workshops that saw no cameras, passing along knowledge of how to read moose tracks through spruce groves, how to stitch a wound with sinew thread, how to keep machinery running in conditions that would defeat anything purchased from a store. Alaska's Department of Fish and Game tracked a 14% decline in subsistence hunting licenses during the years of Otto's decline, directly connected to the disappearance of experienced mentors. The median age of active subsistence hunters climbed from 42 to 49 during that same period. These aren't television statistics, they're measurements of something actually leaving the world. Discovery had spent 12 seasons pretending to celebrate the homesteading lifestyle while replacing its substance with aesthetics. Even demonstrating store-bought ferro rod fire starting for a TikTok audience was a categorically different thing from what Otto had been doing in those off-camera workshops, and the Juneau Empire called it exactly what it was: REI survival, not real subsistence. The land itself was accelerating away from the version Otto had mastered over 7 decades. Homer's average winter temperature had climbed more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1950, thawing permafrost that had anchored Kilcher outbuildings for generations. The original 160 acres Ewell staked in 1941 now sat in a county where 62% of subsistence permits went unused, not for lack of land but for lack of knowledge that makes land useful. Corporate logging had received a 2021 Tongass exemption, allowing 38,000 acres of old-growth cuts 12 miles from the homestead. Tourism operations advertised homestead experiences for $475 a night, under the tagline, "Live like Otto," and the family's 80-year-old, well-pumped 30% less each summer. Alaska's real subsistence licenses had dropped 14% since 2019. The show was selling a dream that climate change, corporate development, and tourist infrastructure were actively dismantling, and it kept selling that dream right through Otto's diminishment without ever acknowledging the contradiction. What Otto's story demands of everyone who watched it is honesty about the transaction they were participating in. Every dramatic promo that spiked your heart rate, every season finale you stayed up for, that was a real person on the other side of that need. Not a character, not a persona built for consumption, but a man with a failing artery and hands that had started to shake. Beautiful suffering is still suffering, and when producers greenlit that drone shot of him dragging himself through the snow, and editors added the violin swell, and the network scheduled it for sweeps week, the audience became part of the decision. Otto didn't fake the bruises or stage the gurney. He was surviving, with a camera in his face. And somewhere in that chain of choices, the line between storytelling and surveillance got crossed, without anyone stopping to mark the moment. He walked out of that hospital with more hardware in his body than when he went in, and a quality in his eyes that never quite returned, something more knowing and more tired, replacing the stubborn blankness that had made him so watchable. Millions of people watching him be alone in that way didn't make it any less solitary. What the story of Otto Kilcher ultimately leaves behind isn't a lesson about resilience or frontier life. It leaves behind a question that reality television has been successfully avoiding since the format was invented. What do we owe the people whose real lives we consume as entertainment? And at what point does the applause we offer them become a way of avoiding the harder conversation about the price they paid? Otto Kilcher survived everything the Alaskan frontier could throw at him, and he survived what the cameras did too, and both of those things cost him something that never showed up in a ratings report.